In 1968, Dodge engineers looked at a problem and came up with a solution so effective, so brutally dominant, that the entire sport of drag racing had to change its rules just to stop them. This is the story of the Dodge Superstock Hemi Dart, a car so fast, so relentlessly victorious, that the NHRA eventually said, "Enough is enough." Along the way, we'll encounter factory-backed warfare, lightweight engineering pushed to absurd extremes, and a winning streak that made competitors wonder why they even showed up. So let's begin. But first, how did Chrysler end up building what might be the most ruthlessly purpose-built drag car ever to wear a license plate? To understand the Superstock Hemi Dart, you need to understand the world it was born into. The late 1960s were the golden age of American muscle. Ford, GM, Chrysler. They weren't just competing for sales, they were competing for bragging rights. And nowhere did those bragging rights matter more than at the drag strip. See, drag racing in the 60s wasn't some niche hobby. It was mainstream. Tens of thousands of fans packed into tracks every weekend to watch factory-backed teams blast down the quarter mile. The manufacturers understood something crucial: win on Sunday, sell on Monday. A victory at a major NHRA event translated directly into showroom traffic. Young guys would walk into dealerships and say, "I want what won last weekend." The competition classes were brutal. Superstock was where the real action happened. These weren't tube-frame race cars wearing fiberglass bodies. These were supposed to be production vehicles, cars you could theoretically buy from a dealer. I say theoretically because, well, the manufacturers got creative, very creative. By 1967, Chrysler had a problem. Their big Hemi engine, the legendary 426, was an absolute monster. 425 horsepower from the factory, probably closer to 500 in race trim. But it lived in big, heavy cars. The Coronet, the Belvedere, these things tipped the scales at nearly 3,500 pounds. And in drag racing, weight is the enemy. Here's the thing about drag racing physics. It's simple math. Power-to-weight ratio determines everything. You can add horsepower, which gets expensive and eventually hits limits, or you can remove weight, which is often more effective pound for pound. The engineers at Chrysler looked at their competition and realized they were bringing a sledgehammer to a knife fight. They had the power. They needed less car. The solution? Take the smallest car in the Dodge lineup, the compact Dart, and somehow, someway, stuff that enormous Hemi engine under its hood. On paper, it sounds straightforward. In practice, it was engineering lunacy. The Dart was never designed for a Hemi. The engine bay was too small. The frame rails were too narrow. The suspension was built for a slant 6, not 500 horsepower. But Chrysler wasn't interested in what the car was designed for. They were interested in winning. The project was handed to Hurst Performance, the same company that made those iconic shifters. Hurst had experience modifying Chrysler products, and they had the facilities to handle a limited production run. The plan was simple in concept: build enough cars to satisfy NHRA homologation requirements, make them as light as possible, and dominate Superstock. Now, I should mention, this wasn't Chrysler's first rodeo with lightweight specials. Back in 1963, they'd built a small batch of lightweight Plymouths and Dodges. But those were conventional big cars made lighter. This was different. This was taking a compact car and turning it into something genuinely terrifying. The transformation started with the body. Every piece of steel that could be replaced with lighter material was swapped out. The hood, fenders, and doors were made from fiberglass. The side windows and rear glass were switched to thin acrylic plastic. Even the door hinges were made from lightweight aluminum. Every single ounce mattered. Inside, the Dart was stripped to nothing. No radio, no heater, no sound deadening. The seats were thin, lightweight buckets. The carpeting was replaced with rubber mats. The dashboard was the most basic unit Dodge offered. If it didn't help the car go faster in a straight line, it was deleted. The suspension was rebuilt from scratch. The front end was modified to accept the massive Hemi, which required cutting and reshaping the shock towers. The rear suspension got beefier leaf springs to handle the torque. And the rear axle? A Dana 60, the strongest unit available because anything less would simply break. But the engine, that's where this car became something special. The 426 Hemi in these Darts wasn't your showroom stock unit. It was the A102 package, which was Chrysler's speak for all-out race engine. Dual 4-barrel carburetors on a cross-ram intake manifold, Magnafluxed connecting rods, special solid-lifter camshaft, headers instead of manifolds. This thing made somewhere north of 500 horsepower, though Chrysler officially rated it at 425. Nobody believed that number for a second. The transmission was a 4-speed manual with a Hurst shifter connected to a bulletproof clutch rated for the abuse of repeated launches. The entire drivetrain was built with one purpose: survive repeated full-power launches and deliver every available horsepower to the rear tires. When all was said and done, the superstock Hemi Dart weighed around 3,000 pounds. Some sources say slightly less. Compare that to the full-size Hemi cars at 3,400 or 3,500 pounds. That might not sound like much, but in drag racing, those 400 to 500 pounds were worth several tenths of a second in the quarter mile. At this level of competition, several tenths was an eternity. Chrysler built approximately 80 of these cars in 1968. Half were Dodge Darts. Half were Plymouth Barracudas with the same treatment. They were sold through dealers technically, but good luck finding one on a showroom floor. These cars went straight to racers, often with factory support. This wasn't about selling cars to the public. This was about winning races. If you've made it this far, you're probably into this kind of stuff. Quick question, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. And hey, subscribe if you haven't. We do this every week. All right, here's where it gets interesting, because when these cars hit the track, they didn't just win, they annihilated the competition. The 1968 NHRA season became a showcase of Chrysler dominance. The superstock Hemi Darts and Barracudas were running low 11-second quarter miles right out of the box. With tuning, some dipped into the high tens. This was insane performance for a car wearing license plates. For context, most muscle cars of the era were doing mid to high 14-second quarters. The Hemi Dart was 3 full seconds faster. At the Winter Nationals, Chrysler cars swept their classes. At the Spring Nationals, same story. Regional events? Forget about it. If you showed up with a Ford or Chevy, you were racing for second place. The names became legendary. Ronnie Sox, who would go on to be one of the most successful drag racers in history, campaigned a Hemi Dart with devastating effectiveness. Dick Landy, another Chrysler factory driver, was nearly unbeatable. The competition wasn't just losing, they were being embarrassed. Here's where the story takes a turn. The NHRA had a problem. Their superstock class was supposed to showcase competition between manufacturers. That was the entire point. Ford versus Chevy versus Mopar, may the best car win. But when one car wins everything, every time, people stop watching. The Ford guys get discouraged. The Chevy guys get discouraged. Sponsors get nervous. The class becomes a Chrysler exhibition, not a competition. The officials started looking at the Hemi Dart with increasing skepticism. Was it really a production vehicle? Could you actually buy one at a dealer? The cars met the letter of the homologation rules, sure. Chrysler had built the required number. But the spirit of superstock was production-based vehicles, and these Darts were about as production as a Formula One car wearing street tires. Think about it. Fiberglass body panels, acid-dipped steel to reduce weight further, race-prepped engines, lightweight glass. These weren't cars that anyone was driving to work. They were purpose-built race machines that happened to have VINs and titles. The NHRA's response was predictable but devastating. They changed the rules. First came the weight adjustments. The sanctioning body started adding weight penalties to the Hemi cars, requiring them to carry ballast to offset their advantage. If your car was too light for its power output, you had to bolt lead weights into it until the formula balanced out. Then came the classification changes. The Hemi Dart got bumped into faster classes where it had to compete against even more extreme machinery, cars with full tube frames, cars with superchargers, cars that made the Dart's 500 horsepower look modest. Then the real hammer fell. The NHRA tightened the definition of what constituted a production vehicle, the kind of modifications that made the Hemi Dart possible, the fiberglass bodies, the lightweight panels, the acid-dipped components. Those became illegal for superstock competition. If you wanted to run that stuff, you had to move to a class where it was allowed, which meant competing against cars with even more extreme modifications. The result? The superstock Hemi Dart became uncompetitive almost overnight, not because it got slower. It was exactly as fast as before, but because the rules had been specifically rewritten to neutralize its advantages. The car that had dominated the sport was legislated into obsolescence. Now, I want to be clear about something. The NHRA wasn't being unfair, exactly. Their job was to maintain competitive balance. When one manufacturer finds a loophole and exploits it to the point where nobody else can win, the sanctioning body has to respond. That's how rules evolve. That's how competition works. But there's no denying that the Hemi Dart was special. It represented the absolute peak of what factory-backed superstock racing could achieve before the rules caught up. For one glorious season, Chrysler had found the formula, and nobody else could touch them. The irony is that the car's dominance ultimately hurt Chrysler's racing program. The rule changes that followed forced them to develop entirely new vehicles for the evolving classes. The investment that had gone into the Hemi Dart program was essentially written off. All those wins, all that engineering brilliance, and the car only got one real season of competition before the regulations made it a dinosaur. There's a lesson in there somewhere about the relationship between innovation and regulation. Push too hard, win too convincingly, and the rules changed to pull you back. The Hemi Dart didn't lose because it was outrun, it lost because it won too much. But here's what makes the story interesting from a historical perspective. The superstock Hemi Dart wasn't some secret weapon that caught everyone by surprise. Chrysler's competitors knew it was coming. Ford and GM had spies. They saw the cars being built. They could have responded with their own lightweight specials. They chose not to or couldn't execute in time, or simply underestimated how dominant the combination would be. When the Dart started winning, the competition didn't have anything ready. Ford's Mustang was too heavy. Chevy's Camaro wasn't set up for this kind of racing. By the time they could have developed a response, the rules had already changed. Chrysler had exploited a window that existed for maybe 18 months, and they exploited it completely. The drivers who campaigned these cars look back on that era with a mix of pride and frustration. Pride because they were unbeatable, frustration because they only got that one season. Ronnie Sox moved on to other classes and continued winning for years, but he always spoke about the Hemi Dart as something special, a pure racing car disguised as a compact sedan. What happened to the cars themselves? Most continued racing in various forms. Some moved to classes where their modifications were legal. Some were updated and continued competing as the rules evolved. A few, the lucky ones, were preserved and eventually became collector pieces. Today, a genuine superstock Hemi Dart is one of the most valuable muscle cars in existence. We're talking 7 figures for a documented example. Only about 80 were built across both the Dart and Barracuda versions. Many were crashed, stripped for parts, or simply wore out from years of hard racing. The survivors are incredibly rare. Think about what that means. A car that was built specifically to exploit a racing loophole that competed for essentially one season before being regulated out. That was never intended for street use. That car is now worth more than most people's houses. The very qualities that made it controversial in 1968, the fact that it was barely a production vehicle, make it priceless today. The superstock Hemi Dart also represented the end of an era. After the rule changes that followed its dominance, factory involvement in superstock racing began to decline. The class evolved into something different, more strictly regulated, less amenable to the kind of engineering creativity that Chrysler had demonstrated. The Wild West period of superstock was over. Manufacturers shifted their attention to other forms of racing. Pro stock emerged as the new premier drag racing class, with its own set of rules and requirements. The factory lightweight specials gave way to purpose-built race cars that made no pretense of being production vehicles. The era of taking a compact sedan and stuffing the biggest engine imaginable under its hood was finished. And what of Chrysler? They continued racing, of course. They developed new cars for the new classes. The Hemi engine remained a dominant force in various forms of competition for years to come. But they never again achieved quite the same level of complete dominance that the superstock Hemi Dart had provided. That moment, that single season of invincibility, was unrepeatable. The story of the Dodge superstock Hemi Dart is ultimately a story about winning too well, about finding the perfect combination of power and weight, exploiting it completely, and watching the competition scramble to respond, not by building better cars, but by changing what was allowed. It's a story about the difference between the letter of the rules and the spirit of the rules, and what happens when someone follows the former while ignoring the latter. Some would say Chrysler cheated. The cars met the homologation requirements. They were technically legal. Others would say they broke the spirit of competition by building cars that no normal customer could ever purchase or use. Both perspectives have merit. What's undeniable is that for one brief, glorious season, the Hemi Dart was the fastest thing on four wheels at every superstock event in America. The competitors who raced against it remember the frustration of knowing they had no chance. The drivers who drove it remember the thrill of absolute confidence at the starting line. And the engineers who built it remember pushing the boundaries of what a production vehicle could mean, finding every possible advantage, and creating something that the sport had never seen before. Not bad for a car that started life as a compact family sedan. Chrysler had looked at the rules, looked at their competitors, and asked a simple question: what if we just built the best possible car and let everyone else figure out how to respond? The answer turned out to be rule changes, weight penalties, and classification adjustments. The answer turned out to be legislation. But for that one season, before the rules caught up, the Dodge superstock Hemi Dart was untouchable. And that's something the record books can never take away. And that is the story of how Dodge built a car so good that drag racing had to change its rules just to make things fair again. If you enjoyed this one, subscribe for more. Let me know in the comments, had you heard of the Hemi Dart before this? Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.